Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a couple of questions for the proponent on Section 2 of the amendment.
Please prepare yourself. Representative Steinberg, please proceed. Representative Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Section 2, starting on line 14, deals with essentially the custody and destruction of excess or undesired controlled substances, prescribes standards under the Commissioner of Consumer Protection for security and safeguard, and then goes on in Section B to talk about long-term care facility and two or more of the following persons to be able to jointly dispose. And then in Section C, talking about an outpatient surgical facility, also two or more persons to take custody and dispose. And I look at Section D, and we don't have that same level of control. And I'm familiar with two-person control in a number of instances and the requirements for that. So through you, Mr. Speaker, I'm curious why in Section D we have a single person, a registered nurse from a home health care agency, as opposed to the two-person control that seems to be appropriately mandated in the rest of that section. Through you.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, through you. And I want to thank the good representative for highlighting this section because it is an area we spend a lot of time discussing. You'll note in sections B and C, those are controlled circumstances, contexts. Those are facilities in which you will have a number of medical professionals available to have the highest level of protocol and security and making good decisions on the destruction of the unused medication. It's somewhat different in the home setting. And that's why we've asked usually the supervising nurse to be responsible for having the conversation with the family in the home setting because it's not the same circumstance. We had a lot of conversation. We struggled about how best to manage this circumstance because we recognize there is a lot of unused medication in a home setting which might otherwise not be taken care of, perhaps at the death of the individual or just at the termination of the need for care. So we were as stringent as we could be given that context. And that does describe the reason between that section and the two previous sections. Through you.
Representative Frank.
I thank the proponent for that answer, and I certainly understand the unique situation dealing in a home health care setting. My concern really, as I look at the first two, B and C, we're not dealing with the nurse that's caring for the patient. If we look at that, we're looking at a level above that. We're looking at directors, assistant directors, administrators in both those facilities, and certainly there is a greater structure in those situations. My concern is we are setting up an individual now with having to take custody of a controlled substance, and the only protection that individual has is the written log, as opposed to the two-person control, which seems to be prudent. So I guess the question I would have for the proponent, was there any testimony of concern or how the nurses would deal with this particular situation and any concern they had on protecting themselves since they're licensed, and any issue that they might have could result in the revocation of their license, their ability to perform their job. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you. A good question. And again, we spent a lot of time discussing this. Obviously, the home setting is a little different, but we felt that we had to balance the risk inherent of unused medication ending up in the wrong hands versus having anything more stringent than we were able to put in there. We believe this reflects our best efforts to provide that kind of stringent, rigorous control in that different circumstance. And we're pretty confident that it's going to work out well in this context. Again, it's not in a facility, so we have to make some allowances for the conditions, but we felt it was very important that we seek to take that unused medication out of circulation. It was important enough to make these allowances. Through you.
Representative Frank.
And I thank you for that consideration, and I agree with you on the concern of ensuring as expeditiously as possible that any opioid drugs that are no longer needed be taken out of the general public and being disposed of or cared for appropriately. One final question is there any federal law that requires two-person control of this category of drug? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Steinberg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Through you, I am not aware of it. It is possible. Through you.
Representative Frank.
Thank you. And just a final commentary on this. And I appreciate the challenge that is inherent in home health care, and you generally have a single nurse who is providing that care. And certainly a registered nurse being licensed has a certain level of experience and training. But I also recognize that we seem to be taking, I won't say a shortcut, but a process where we ought to be taking more care to maintain that two-person control. And so having a nurse who is there routinely is not usually an individual visit. If you're a part of a home health care agency, you're likely seeing that patient, if not daily, then weekly, that there ought to be a provision that if there's identification, whether it be through the patient passing on or no longer needing care, that instead of that individual being responsible solely, they would then come back maybe the next day or that afternoon and have a protocol where they would bring a second person to maintain that two-person control, just as we do in the facility. So I would urge the proponent to consider that potentially in the future to improve this bill for the care of the nurse, who, if they lose their license, loses their ability to perform the job that they have trained for and worked for much of their life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.